The moment her eyes locked with mine, everything changed. She knew I had seen her. There, under the soft glow of the rose trellis, her lips on his, her laughter echoing in the garden like a cruel taunt. For a split second, guilt flashed across her face, before she turned and walked back into the party, leaving him standing there in confusion and me rooted in place, drink forgotten in my hand. She thought I was hurt, that I'd sulk in silence or erupt in anger. She thought she could smooth things over with apologies, excuses, or maybe even tears. But as I stood there in the cool night air, my rage simmered into something sharper, colder. I wasn't just upset, I was calculating. This wasn't the end of the story, it was only the beginning. I would make her regret every choice, every lie, every betrayal. Now, when I was done, she wouldn't just lose me, she'd lose everything. But before we dive deeper into this tale, let me know where you're watching this story from in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss what's coming next. The estate gleamed under the soft glow of string lights, a modern masterpiece of glass and steel that spoke of wealth and ambition. Inside, the air buzzed with conversation and laughter, mingling with the faint clink of champagne flutes. Socialites adorned in designer suits and glittering gowns moved effortlessly through the space, their voices rising and falling in melodic waves. John lingered near the edges of the room, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his posture deliberate yet reserved. He was out of place here, his quiet demeanor at odds with the glittering chaos. His eyes, sharp and observant, tracked Emily as she glided through the crowd, her confidence radiating like a beacon. Emily was in her element, her laughter ringing out as she charmed one guest after another. Her emerald dress hugged her figure, commanding attention with every step. John watched her from the shadows, a contrast to her brilliance, a steady anchor to her ever-shifting tide. As he sipped his drink, a flicker of unease stirred in him. Something about tonight felt different, though he couldn't yet name it. Moments like this, he reminded himself, were what she lived for, and what left him feeling increasingly adrift. And yet, the night was only just beginning. Emily moved through the room with a practiced grace, her smile wide and inviting, her laughter like the delicate chime of crystal glasses. She leaned in close to a man she had just met, her hand brushing his arm as she spoke. The gesture was fleeting, subtle enough to seem innocent, yet intimate enough to spark unease in John. He shifted his weight, watching from a distance, his chest tightening with an inexplicable tension. Emily had always been friendly, her warmth a natural extension of her charm. But tonight, her interactions felt different. There was an edge to her playfulness, a lingering gaze here, a soft laugh there, that set his nerves on edge. When she caught his eye across the room, her smile faltered for just a second, then quickly returned, brighter than before. John felt the crack in his trust widen, though he told himself he was imagining things. Still, as Emily threw her head back in laughter at a comment he couldn't hear, he couldn't shake the gnawing sense that something was slipping away from him. And so, the whispers of betrayal began, quiet and insidious, leaving John to wonder whether they were real or merely shadows of his own doubts. The night had stretched into its glittering peak, with music drifting softly through the estate and the guests growing increasingly uninhibited. John, seeking a reprieve from the polished chaos, stepped out into the garden. The cool night air was a welcome relief, and the glow of fairy lights cast a dreamy, almost surreal ambience over the manicured hedges. As he wandered further from the house, the faint sound of laughter caught his attention, a laugh that was all too familiar. It was Emily's, but there was something different about it, something unguarded and free. His steps slowed, unease coiling in his chest as he followed the sound. Near the rose trellis, partially obscured by shadows, John stopped. What he saw rooted him to the spot. Emily was there, her back to him, but her posture left no ambiguity. She was standing close, too close, to Ryan, a man John recognized from previous gatherings. Ryan's hand rested lightly on her waist, their bodies angled toward each other with an intimacy that defied explanation. John's breath hitched as Ryan leaned in, brushing his lips against Emily's ear in a way that felt painfully deliberate. She laughed again, that same carefree laugh he hadn't heard in years, before tilting her head to meet Ryan's kiss. It wasn't hesitant or fleeting. It was deep, deliberate, and intimate. A kiss that spoke of familiarity and desire. For a moment, John stood frozen, his drink forgotten in his hand. His mind raced, trying to reconcile the scene before him with the woman he thought he knew. Then, as if sensing his presence, Emily's eyes darted up. They locked onto his, and in that brief, searing moment, guilt and fear flared across her face. She pulled back abruptly, smoothing her dress in a futile attempt to erase what had just transpired. Without a word, she turned and walked briskly toward the house, her heels clicking against the stone path. Ryan stood motionless, his expression a mix of confusion and frustration. But John didn't look at him again. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the party in the distance. Slowly, John set his glass down on the edge of a stone bench. His chest burned, not just with anger, but with something colder, sharper. He had hoped that the nagging feeling from earlier in the evening was nothing more than paranoia. But now the truth stood undeniable before him. He finally turned to leave the garden. One thought crystallized in his mind. This was not the time for anger. This was the time for calculation. John stood in the shadows of the garden, the image of Emily and Ryan seared into his mind like a brand. At first, there was rage, hot and consuming, a storm threatening to tear through him. His fists clenched instinctively, his breathing uneven, as a flood of emotions surged within him. Anger, humiliation, disbelief. The person he had trusted most had dismantled the very foundation of their life together. But as the seconds ticked by, something inside him shifted. The fiery anger cooled, hardening into something far more dangerous, a cold, deliberate resolve. This wasn't the time to lash out or confront her in a fit of fury. No, that would be too easy, too predictable. Emily's betrayal deserved more than an impulsive reaction. It demanded precision, a reckoning she wouldn't see coming. After being strangled, they were driven to the safe house of the third wing. John's mind began to race, but not with questions of why or how. Instead, it calculated the steps ahead, mapping out every detail like a chessboard. His pain, raw and sharp, became the fuel for his determination. He would not be the victim. By the time he returned to the glowing lights of the party, his decision was clear. Emily had made her move, and now it was his turn. The game had just begun. John sat in the quiet of their living room that night, the glow of a single lamp casting long shadows on the walls. His mind churned, replaying the scene from the garden, but he forced himself to stay calm. Confronting Emily now would only lead to excuses, tears, and denials. He needed evidence, solid, irrefutable proof that would strip away her ability to manipulate or deceive him. With calculated precision, John began formulating a plan. He knew Emily's patterns well, her routines, her habits, and, most importantly, her weaknesses. Trusting her complacency, he decided to start small. Her phone. Emily had never been careful with it, often leaving it unattended, assuming John had no interest in snooping. He waited for the right moment. Late at night, when Emily showered, John carefully picked up her phone. Her passcode was almost laughably easy to guess. Her mother's birthday, something she always used. The screen unlocked with a quiet click, and his heart pounded. Not with guilt, but with anticipation. This wasn't about catching her off guard. It was about control. Emily had taken away his peace, his trust, and his dignity. Now he would reclaim power on his own terms. As the screen illuminated, John's resolve solidified. He moved methodically, scanning through Emily's messages first. At a glance, everything appeared ordinary. Texts from friends, family, and coworkers. But John wasn't looking for the obvious. His eyes narrowed as he spotted a thread marked Linda Yoga, an innocuous name hiding something far more sinister. Opening the thread, he found what he expected. The messages started light, friendly, but grew increasingly intimate as the weeks unfolded. Flirty comments gave way to suggestive emojis, followed by explicit details of their clandestine meetings. Ryan wasn't just a passing flirtation, he was a recurring fixture in Emily's life. John's hands clenched as he read, but he kept his emotions in check. This was no time for anger. Instead, he screenshotted everything, saving it to a secure folder on his own phone. The more he uncovered, the more determined he became. His instincts had been right, and now he had the proof to back them up. Next, he turned to Emily's email. This required more finesse, as her work laptop was usually locked. But luck favored John. Emily had left it open earlier that evening. Sitting at the dining table, he combed through her inbox, searching for receipts, travel confirmations, anything out of place. It didn't take long to find them. Hotel bookings, strategically timed work trips, and even selfies she'd taken in unfamiliar settings, all sent to Ryan. The weight of her deception was staggering, but John didn't flinch. He carefully forwarded every piece of incriminating evidence to his own email, ensuring nothing could be lost. Finally, he enabled location sharing on Emily's phone, a feature she hadn't even realized existed. Over the next few days, he would track her movements, adding timestamps and locations to his growing dossier. By the time he finished, it was nearly dawn. Emily still slept upstairs, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing beneath her roof. John set his tools aside and poured himself a drink. His emotions, once a chaotic storm of betrayal and fury, were now a quiet sea of focus. It was about taking control of the narrative. And as the first rays of sunlight broke through the window, John allowed himself a grim smile. Emily had no idea what was coming. The next few days were a master class in patience and precision. John immersed himself in the meticulous task of assembling an airtight case, determined to ensure there would be no room for denial or manipulation. He wasn't just collecting evidence. He was crafting a narrative that would expose Emily's betrayal in the most undeniable terms. Starting with the screenshots he had taken from Emily's phone, John organized them chronologically. Each message, each emoji, each explicit line was saved into a neatly labeled folder. He ensured the timestamps were visible, creating a clear timeline of the affair. It was methodical, almost clinical, as he worked to strip away any ambiguity. To further solidify his case, he added Ryan's replies, ensuring the story unfolded as a two-sided betrayal, not just Emily's indiscretions. Moving beyond digital evidence, John began utilizing location tracking. Over the next several days, he followed Emily's movements through the feature he'd enabled on her phone. Whenever she claimed to be running errands or meeting coworkers, John stayed one step ahead, quietly documenting her visits to suspicious locations. Ryan's apartment, a downtown cafe, a hotel just outside the city. From his car, parked at a safe distance, he captured photographs. Emily stepping into the cafe with Ryan, her laugh evident even through the lens, her hand casually resting on his arm. Next, John turned his attention to financial records. He quietly accessed their joint bank account, combing through transactions that had once seemed innocuous, but now painted a different picture. Lunches at upscale restaurants, boutique hotel bookings, even a spa day. All expenses Emily had attributed to work or self-care, but were now clearly tied to her secret life. He printed statements highlighting transactions that aligned with her meetings with Ryan. Finally, John compiled the most damning evidence yet, photographs and emails retrieved from Emily's work laptop. Among them were selfies she'd sent to Ryan, intimate and playful, bearing expressions John hadn't seen in years. Each image was saved and categorized, forming the final pieces of his case. By the end of the week, John had assembled a dossier that was both exhaustive and devastating. As he reviewed his work, there was no satisfaction, only a cold sense of purpose. Every piece of evidence was a weapon, and when the time came, he would wield them all without hesitation. The trap was set. Now, it was only a matter of time. The suggestion came over breakfast, John's tone casual as he poured coffee into Emily's mug. "I've been thinking," he said, feigning thoughtfulness. "It's been a while since we've had time for just us. What do you think about a weekend getaway? Something quiet. A cabin in the woods, maybe?" Emily looked up, her surprise quickly replaced by a warm, practiced smile.
"That sounds nice,"
she said, her voice light, but her fingers tapped nervously against the table. John pretended not to notice. "It'll be good to reconnect," he added, watching her carefully for a flicker of hesitation. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A brief tightening of her lips, a faint shadow crossing her expression before she nodded. Over the next few days, John planned the trip with painstaking precision. The cabin, nestled deep in the woods, was the perfect blend of rustic charm and isolation. He'd packed everything they'd need, from hiking gear to a carefully selected bottle of wine. To Emily, it seemed like an attempt to rekindle their marriage. To John, it was the perfect stage for the next act of his plan. By Friday morning, they were on the road. Emily's chatter filled the car, her usual charm laced with a forced cheerfulness. John responded just enough to keep the facade intact, all the while studying her every word, every glance. As they approached the cabin, its remote location in towering pines cloaked them in a quiet that felt almost suffocating. The first evening passed with an air of deceptive normalcy. They cooked dinner together, sipping wine by the fire as Emily shared anecdotes from work. John listened, his responses measured, his gaze steady. But beneath his calm exterior, he was laying traps. "Do you remember our first trip together?" he asked suddenly, his voice soft but pointed. Emily paused mid-sip, her eyes darting to his. "Of course," she said, smiling faintly. "The beach house." John nodded, letting a small silence stretch before adding, Funny how much can change over the years." Emily's smile faltered, her fingers tightening around her glass. "What do you mean?" she asked, her tone light but edged with unease. John shrugged, keeping his expression neutral. "Just an observation." The next day, he suggested a hike to a nearby overlook. Emily hesitated, clearly unenthusiastic about the idea, but she agreed. As they climbed the winding trail, John pointed out landmarks and remarked on the beauty of the scenery. "It's peaceful, isn't it?" he said, his voice carrying a quiet weight. "A place where nothing can hide." Emily glanced at him, her expression guarded. "Yes," she murmured, though her tone lacked conviction. Throughout the trip, John dropped more subtle remarks, references to trust, to transparency, to the importance of honesty in a relationship. Each comment landed like a pebble in a pond, rippling through Emily's composure. Her usual confidence seemed to waver, her laughter less genuine, her movements less assured. By the time they returned to the cabin that evening, Emily's unease was palpable. She busied herself with meaningless tasks, straightening cushions, refilling her glass, but her distracted gaze and restless energy betrayed her growing anxiety. John watched silently, the weight of her discomfort fueling his resolve. The cracks were forming, and soon they would shatter. The cabin's serene isolation, cloaked in the stillness of tall pines and whispering winds, provided the perfect backdrop for John's carefully orchestrated dismantling of Emily's life. While Emily wandered through their temporary retreat, her guard seemingly lowered, John's work began in earnest. Late one evening, as Emily slept upstairs, John sat by the fire, his laptop open on the rustic coffee table. His fingers moved swiftly, typing the final details of an anonymous email to her boss. The message was concise but damning, accompanied by carefully selected attachments, explicit screenshots of Emily's messages to Ryan and receipts for their secret meetings. The subject line read, "For your eyes only, confidential employee conduct." A single click sent it into the ether, and John allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction. The next morning, over coffee, Emily seemed distracted. She scrawled through her phone absent-mindedly, blissfully unaware of the email that had landed in her supervisor's inbox hours earlier. John watched her closely, his expression neutral, silently wondering how long it would take for the consequences to ripple back. By mid-afternoon, John moved to the next phase. This time, the target was Ryan. Using a new email account created specifically for this purpose, he sent incriminating evidence of the affair to Ryan's employer and several key figures within his social circle. The message hinted at impropriety in Ryan's personal life that could damage his professional reputation. The attached images, carefully curated to maximize impact, ensured the message wouldn't be ignored. John hit send and leaned back, the glow of the laptop screen reflecting the cold determination in his eyes. Throughout the day, John dropped hints designed to unsettle Emily further. Over dinner, he casually remarked, Work must be stressful these days. So much pressure to stay professional, isn't there? Emily looked up sharply, her smile strained as she murmured in agreement. Later, as they sat by the fire, John's phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen, ensuring Emily saw nothing, before reading the confirmation from his contact. Ryan's employer had begun an internal review. The dominoes were falling, and soon neither Emily nor Ryan would have any illusions of control. By the end of their stay, the cabin's peaceful facade had given way to an undercurrent of tension. Emily remained oblivious to the storm John had unleashed, but the subtle cracks in her composure told him she sensed something was wrong. For John, the stage was now set for the final act. The cracks in Emily's carefully curated life began as whispers. Her phone buzzed incessantly one morning, pulling her from sleep. Groggy and confused, she opened the first message, a terse email from her boss requesting an urgent meeting. The subject line, "Allegations of professional misconduct," sent a chill down her spine. By the time she arrived at the office, the atmosphere had shifted. Colleagues avoided her gaze, conversations hushed as she passed. In the meeting, her supervisor laid out the evidence. Screenshots of explicit messages, travel receipts, and photos of her meetings with Ryan. Emily stammered, denying the accusations, but her protest rang hollow. The company announced her immediate suspension pending investigation, effectively leaving her without income. Meanwhile, her personal life crumbled with equal ferocity. Friends she had trusted for years distanced themselves as the same damning evidence circulated in their group chats. "I thought I knew you," one text read, a gutting reminder of the betrayal others now felt. The whispers evolved into outright avoidance, leaving Emily isolated in the very social circles she had once thrived in. At home, Emily tried to call Ryan, her lifeline in this storm, but his number was disconnected. He too had become collateral damage. The news of his involvement had reached his workplace and his wife, dismantling his life as swiftly as hers. Each day brought a new wave of humiliation and isolation. Emily's once flawless reputation was reduced to rubble, and her carefully constructed facade shattered under the weight of the truth. John watched the fallout with quiet precision. Each step he'd planned unfolded like clockwork, leaving Emily with nowhere to turn. Her suspension was only the beginning. That same week, he finalized the transfer of all their joint assets into accounts under his sole control. Emily had always trusted him to handle their finances, a trust he now used against her. When she tried to make a payment for groceries, her card was declined. Confused and panicked, she called John. "It must be a banking error," he replied smoothly, knowing full well there was no error. Only his plan. John didn't stop there. He filed for divorce, presenting the court with an airtight case of infidelity supported by the evidence he'd meticulously gathered. Emily, blindsided and financially crippled, could do little to fight back. The court awarded John almost everything: the house, the car, and the bulk of their assets. She was left with little more than her personal belongings and a mountain of debt. The final blow came at the charity gala, an event Emily had once eagerly anticipated. That evening, the whispers reached their crescendo. A leaked article titled "The Rise and Fall of a Socialite: Scandal Rocks Elite Circles" dominated phones and conversations. The photos, timestamps, and explicit details laid bare the full extent of her betrayal. As Emily entered the ballroom, the room seemed to freeze. Stares followed her, some filled with pity, others with thinly veiled judgment. One acquaintance approached her with a knowing look. "Is it true?" they asked softly, the question laced with both curiosity and disdain. Emily stammered, unable to answer. John, standing in the shadows, watched it all unfold with calculated detachment. He'd ensured that Emily's downfall was as public as her betrayal had been private. The humiliation was complete, and for the first time, John felt the weight of his revenge settle. But satisfaction eluded him, replaced by a quiet, unsettling emptiness. The final act was over, but the cost lingered in the silence that followed. The house was eerily silent when Emily finally approached John. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed from days of crying and sleepless nights. She clutched a crumpled letter in her trembling hands, her breath uneven as she stood in the doorway of his study. "Why?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why would you do this to me?" John turned his chair slowly, his expression unreadable. He didn't respond immediately, letting the weight of her desperation hang in the air. Finally, he gestured toward the letter she held. "You already know why," he said coldly. Emily unfolded the paper, her gaze scanning the words she'd already read but couldn't fully comprehend. "I saw you that night," the letter began, the stark black ink a sharp contrast to her trembling hands. "Under the rose trellis, laughing with him like I didn't exist. That was the moment I decided you didn't deserve my forgiveness. You deserved my revenge." The letter outlined every detail: the anonymous tips, the asset transfers, the deliberate exposure of her affair. Emily's legs gave way, and she sank into a chair, tears streaming down her face. John leaned forward, his voice low and unwavering. "You destroyed us, Emily. I only finished what you started." The room fell silent again, but this time, the silence was suffocating. The phone rang late at night, its sharp sound slicing through the quiet of John's home. He hesitated for a moment before answering. The voice on the other end was faint, trembling. It was Emily. "John," she began, her tone fragile, almost unrecognizable. I need to ask you something." "My friendship with you, Sue." John leaned back in his chair, his hand tightening around the phone. "What is it, Emily?" he replied, his voice calm but distant. Her breath hitched, as though summoning the courage to continue. "Was it worth it? Everything you did to destroy me? Did it make you feel better?" The question hung in the air, stark and unyielding. For a moment, John said nothing, the words burrowing deep into his thoughts. He wanted to respond with certainty, to tell her it had been worth every step. Yet, as he stared into the darkness of his empty home, the answer eluded him. "Goodbye, Emily," he finally said, his voice heavy with something he couldn't name. As the call ended, her question lingered, echoing in his mind long after the silence returned. Was it worth it? He wasn't sure. And perhaps, he realized, he never would be. In the days that followed Emily's call, John found himself alone with his thoughts, surrounded by the hollow silence of his triumph. The evidence of his success was everywhere. Emily, once a force of charisma and ambition, was now living in obscurity, stripped of her status, her career, and the life she had once built. He had won. But what lingered in his mind was not the satisfaction of victory, but the question she had asked. Was it worth it? At first, John had been certain that revenge would bring him peace, that dismantling Emily's life piece by piece would heal the wounds she had inflicted. But as the weeks turned into months, he realized that his pain hadn't disappeared, it had simply changed form. The anger that had once consumed him had faded, but in its place was an emptiness he hadn't anticipated. He had poured so much of himself into vengeance that now that it was complete, he wasn't sure who he was anymore. The truth that began to emerge was sobering. Revenge, he realized, doesn't erase betrayal. It amplifies it. It spreads the pain, doubling its reach, turning the victim into a perpetrator. In his quest to make Emily pay, he had sacrificed parts of himself, his compassion, his sense of fairness, and even his ability to move on. The victory, as sweet as it had seemed in the moment, now tasted bitter. Reflecting on his actions, John understood that revenge is not justice. Justice seeks balance, while revenge seeks destruction. And in the pursuit of destruction, he had found only ruin, hers and his own. He had built a fortress of anger, but now, standing within its walls, he found himself trapped. His pain was no longer about Emily's betrayal, but about the person he had become in response to it. John sat alone one evening, staring at the letter he had sent Emily. The words, once filled with righteous fury, now seemed cold and detached. In trying to destroy her, he had unwittingly isolated himself, cutting off his ability to heal. He folded the letter carefully and tucked it into a drawer, as if putting it away could silence the echoes of his choices. In that moment, he realized that the cost of revenge isn't just what you do to others, it's what you lose within yourself. And sometimes those losses are far greater. The speaker's voice softened, their tone no longer one of recounting a story, but of inviting reflection. And so, we come to the end of this tale. John sought revenge, and in many ways he succeeded. But the question remains, did he win? Did he find peace? Or did he trade one kind of pain for another? They paused, allowing the weight of the story to settle over the room. Betrayal is devastating. It shakes our sense of trust and our belief in those we hold closest. But how we respond defines not only the aftermath, but who we become. Revenge may seem like justice, but often it leaves us with scars that linger far longer than the wounds of betrayal itself. The speakers stepped closer to the audience, their gaze steady. So, I ask you now, what would you have done in John's place? Would you choose revenge, risking the loss of yourself in the process? Or would you seek a different path? One of forgiveness, or at least acceptance? These are not easy questions, but they are necessary ones. They concluded with a quiet smile. Trust is fragile and betrayal is shattering, but the true test is in how we rebuild, not just our lives, but ourselves. Share your thoughts, your stories, your perspectives, because in the end, what we choose defines us.